The official account of Fed officials at the time is that they knew that the Lehman failure would be a disaster. They very much wanted to save Lehman Brothers, but their hands were tied because to make a loan to Lehman Brothers, Lehman needed to have a certain amount of collateral, and it didn't have that much collateral. So under the law at the time, it would have been illegal for the Fed to rescue Lehman, and they didn't want to break the law, even though they knew the consequences would be disastrous. So the central thesis of my book is that that account is just not correct, that if one looks carefully at the numbers, Lehman clearly did have enough collateral, so it would have been legal for the Fed to lend to Lehman. It would have been legal, it would not have been very risky to the Fed. The fact that the Fed did not lend was simply a decision they made based on various factors, including political considerations. The Fed could have rescued Lehman Brothers, and if it had, probably the whole financial crisis and the whole Great Recession would not have been as severe. There were many sources that I used, but two of them stand out as especially important. They were two investigations, one by the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which was appointed by Congress, and one by an examiner appointed by the bankruptcy court in the Lehman bankruptcy case. They were both huge efforts with lots and lots of people investigating, and very important, they both had subpoena power. So the documents that they acquired included all sorts of memos and emails among Federal Reserve officials and Lehman Brothers executives in the days leading up to the bankruptcy. So there's really a lot of information out there, which I think a lot of people don't appreciate. Many commentators have offered theories or speculation about what were policymakers thinking, what were their motivations in the days leading up to the bankruptcy. And in many cases, you don't really have to speculate because you can look up the emails they were sending to each other that are available from these investigations. Now the catch is there's a lot of information and it makes it a lot of work to go through it. The bankruptcy examiner's report is well over 2,000 pages with well over 8,000 long footnotes citing countless documents that they gathered, and that's not counting 23 appendices. So what I learned in the course of this research is that there's enough information out there to piece together pretty clearly what happened in the Lehman Brothers episode, but that it takes 4 years of one's life to do so, to actually go through the massive material and find the right pieces of information and piece it together into a coherent story. I've tried to strike a balance in how I present the material. On the one hand, I try to give a lot of detailed evidence for everything that I assert. So there are probably more specific facts and figures in my book than there are in a lot of books about the financial crisis. On the other hand, I've tried to make it not just a technical monograph, but something accessible to as broad an audience as possible. So I've tried to give background on topics that some readers are not familiar with. I've tried as hard as I can, whenever possible, to use plain English instead of technical jargon. And so I hope the book will have a fairly broad appeal. One broad lesson from the crisis is how fragile large financial institutions can be, how vulnerable, if there's a loss of confidence, how vulnerable they can be to a cutoff of lending which they depend on to operate, and how quickly they can face a crisis that forces them into bankruptcy. We've also learned how harmful that kind of financial crisis can be for the whole U.S. economy and the whole world economy. A final thing we've learned is what an effective role the Federal Reserve can potentially play in minimizing the damage from that kind of crisis by serving as what economists call the lender of last resort, by stepping in a crisis and providing cash to keep banks operating until some kind of solution can be worked out to their problems, rather than having a sudden bankruptcy which is very disruptive.